and welcome to this month's Abertay Historical Society talk. Now 2024 marks the HMS Unicorn's 200th anniversary, and the ship is gearing up towards some major conservation and redevelopment works. And at this talk, Matthew Bellhouse Moran, who is the Museum Director at HMS Unicorn, is going to outline the ship's history, its historical significance, and also talk about the ship's ongoing work and the plans for the future. So I am delighted to welcome Matthew and just really excited to hear this. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I keep the time and don't bore you already for 2 hours. So thank you, and I'll just preface this by saying that I'm not an expert in the history of Unicorn. The history of Unicorn has been covered much more in depth and in detail by others elsewhere. So the history, the past section of this presentation, past, present and future, will be very brief and focus more on what we're doing at the moment and what we are planning to do. However, I do recognise that how many of you visited Unicorn in the last 4 or 5 years? Hands up. So about over half the room. Okay, so I don't need to teach you how to suck eggs, basically, so we will not focus on that too much. I'll use the mouse, the clicker doesn't seem to be working. So this isn't Unicorn, but this is Unicorn as she might have been at some point in the past, and you can see that, you know, there's this strange roof on it, and the first thing that visitors still say after 50 years of being a museum ship is, when are you going to take that horrible modern roof off Unicorn? And we have to say, it's not horrible and modern. It is, in parts of it we suspect might be older than the ship itself, parts of it are newer. It has been replaced and patched over the years, but it was standard practice when you built a ship that you didn't need straight away. Obviously you wouldn't rig mast the ship, because that would all be stuff that would rot in the weather and cost an absolute fortune to maintain for no purpose at all. So you would put a roof on, you wouldn't mast and rig to the full extent. You would do that when the ship would be required for action, and it would take about 3 months to fit out. You could do it in less than that if you were very speedy, but I think about 3 to 6 months was usual. And that has had a significant consequence for Unicorn. So the first one is that, unfortunately, Unicorn doesn't quite have the romance of the sails that, other ships, the other ship in Dundee arguably has, about which I am very jealous of the visual impact. I am not jealous of their bills, to be honest, because as I'm sure you're aware, it is very expensive still, as it was then, to maintain rigging outdoors. But what that does mean is that a lot of Unicorn's fabric survives much more than other ships of a similar age, because it's never really been without a roof. And if you know anything about ships, you will know, and again, apologies to those of you who already know, that the decks of a ship are open to the weather. They're wooden planks. They are corked in between, in the seams between, with caulking, which is oakum, so older oakum, tar or pitch, and hammered in. And if you don't maintain it on an annual basis, pretty much, the working of the vessel, the degradation in the weather, means that basically after a while, that deck is no longer waterproof. So rainwater lands on the top deck, and then where does it go? It trickles through, and it goes to the deck below, and then it trickles through and goes to the deck below. And as we know, rainwater is what causes rot, so your ship rots from the inside out. Now, Unicorn has the privilege of being a ship that rots from the outside in. So at least that's only one thing that we have to worry about at the moment. So just to reiterate the importance of Unicorn, 200 years old, but obviously the impetus for this lecture, and it's entirely an excuse to tell you about our future plans really, is she has been in Dundee for 150 years, arriving in Dundee in 1873, but as I'm sure many of you know, she was originally started in 1822 in Chatham Dockyard down south in England, and was launched in 1824. So 200 years old in 2024, which is coming up quite quickly. And I think it's another very interesting and unusual thing about Unicorn is, if you think of a historic ship of any similar age that survives today, they have not been in one spot for anything like 150 years. Unicorn is extremely unusual in the way in which she is now part of Dundee, the city, the heritage of Dundee, the feel of Dundee, what people associate Dundee with being. She is older, or rather has been in, never mind older, has been in Dundee longer than most of the, many of the iconic buildings in Dundee. Caird Hall, St Paul's Cathedral, any number of buildings. Unicorn's been there longer, tucked away in the docks, moving around a little bit, but not too much, always within sort of half a mile of where she is today. And you can see at the bottom from our Statement of Significance 2019 that Unicorn is the equivalent of the best Category A listed building or an internationally important work of art. She's of international significance, comparable significance to vessels such as Victory, Cutty Sark and Mary Rose. Now we know that our reputation, our brand awareness as it were, is not quite up to that standard. I actually had one of the senior executives at the Mary Rose, who I was introduced to earlier this year by email, say, "Oh, I've never heard of Unicorn, what an interesting looking project." And just wanted to pull my hair out, but there we go, we're working on it. So, I mean, this is Unicorn. Well, that's actually nominally a Trincomalee, but really a Leader LEDA class frigate of the same sort of size, shape and age as Unicorn. And this at the bottom is a cutaway of some photogrammetry and laser point cloud surveying we did in 2020 and 2021. And you can see that a lot of the ship sits below the water, and this sort of squat hulk that you see in Victoria Dock is actually a lot bigger on the inside than you would think. We have, depending what you count as a deck, we have 4 decks and the holds. You can see nice, they're all painted slightly different colours, which comes up quite nicely here. So you have the hold, the orlop deck and the cable tier or the rope tier, the mess deck, the gun deck and the weather deck. And the weather deck would have been exposed to the wind and rain had Unicorn ever been fitted out, which she wasn't, but that's now all covered by a roof. And Unicorn's sort of story, it really starts with this gentleman here, Robert Seppings, who was Surveyor of the Navy, so what we would call now one of the first job titles that's sort of equivalent to what we would now call a naval architect. He was a very interesting person, he designed a lot of vessels. And again, one of the reasons Unicorn survives to this day is due to the unusual construction, in as much as Robert Seppings was a very clever man. He trialled a lot of new innovations in shipbuilding, and there are quite a few surviving examples. I won't go through all of them, there's at least half a dozen that I can think of. But he designed experiments that had been trialled in other vessels and come to their sort of fruition in Unicorn, and Unicorn's got quite a lot of them. So one of them is diagonal riders, which was unusual at the time, which adds strength and stiffening to the vessel, along with long seals and well, you can, I don't need to go into detail, but you can see from here basically the principle is that the 5-bar farm gate, that if you put diagonal strengthening in a what is actually, wooden ships are quite flexible, bendy things. People don't think they are, but they are. That's why they've got a natural limit in their feasible size. The properties of wood, they get bendier and bendier as they get longer, and then they break in half. So you need to stiffen the ship and keep it stiff. So he had quite a few interesting innovations. And then we'll skip basically a century of history because time is limited, and again you can read about this in other places, but why did the ship come to Dundee in 1873? Well, the principle is that built in 1824 and launched, and was, we had an architect recently say that, well, the thing that's interesting about Unicorn is that Unicorn was never used, but was cutting edge at the time in her class. And he said it's a bit like a nuclear deterrent, isn't it? Because, you know, you sort of in the immediate circle of Pax Britannica after the Napoleonic Wars, we're coming up to the peak of British naval armament, and you wanted lots of ships and reserves. And she was never really used, and so it was used as a powder hulk for a while and a few other bits and pieces down in England. In 1873, Dundee already had an R&R or RNVR presence in an older ship that was getting a bit tatty and was, you know, well, Unicorn was sent up, was towed up by a paddle steamer to Dundee and started training reserves. And that's what, you know, she did up until the sort of 1950s, early 60s, and then in 1968 was handed over to the charity. And we've got a few photographs here. I've chosen the Wrens because they're the ones that they seem to have quite a resonance with a lot of people in Dundee. A lot of people's mothers and grandmothers were wrens. I'm seeing nods and smiles. And they really were a presence. We have a list from Imperial War Museums where they gave us a list of the name of every wren, not that trained at Unicorn, but that passed through Unicorn, and the list is about 1,800 women, so it's absolutely huge. And you can see the armament is not quite contemporary to 1824 on there. Just because this photograph came through last year, this woman here is called Mary Duncan, and she was her son. She passed away, unfortunately, and her son donated some archival material stuff to us last year, and told us all about Mary's life. And it was really interesting saying how Mary grew up in a close, in tenement close, as did lots of girls her age at the time. She was in her late teens, and her son said that her life was very staid in as much as she was surrounded by chaperones. There weren't many people her own age in the close, and she went and she started training on Unicorn, and all of a sudden she was with unsupervised women of her own age, with a little bit of independence, allowed to go out the house on their own. She bought a motorcycle, and she bombed that around Fife and Angus. She crashed it in Spring Hill and then didn't ride it again after that. And then all these stories came out, and then the story was quite sad, it ended, and then she got married. And that was that. And it just, that's such a shame. The other interesting story that people know about is the surrender of the German U-boat to Unicorn. So in the Second World War, Unicorn was basically made officer in charge of Dundee. And you can see these, I can't remember which one's which, but there's a lieutenant and an overlieutenant from the Kriegsmarine. And essentially, a German U-boat surrendered during the Second World War in Dundee, and of course had to surrender to the naval officer in charge, who was based on Unicorn. And so that is Unicorn there in the background, and we like to think that he's probably just putting his hat on, but it looks like he's banged his head, as our visitors still do every day. And so we are, as far as we know, we're the only Georgian warship to receive a surrender from a submarine. So that's quite So this is the question that comes up a lot, and it's been really interesting talking to people in Dundee, because there are other organisations that are going through the same learning process, and it's so what, because Unicorn's amazing, Unicorn's fantastic, historically a really unusual survivor, incredibly important and underappreciated, and we sort of are so used as a country that values heritage. Because we do, we have National Trust for Scotland, the National Trust in England, we've got all these membership and subscription organisations that demonstrate that as a population, the UK values its heritage, and in Scotland in particular, it's a real key part of the offer for the economy, and tourism, etc. And so we sort of expect to be able to go to funders like the National Lottery, the Memorial Fund and others, and say, we're really old and we're really important and we need money. And they sort of look at you and go, so what? So what? So, well, we're the oldest ship in Scotland, the third oldest in the world that still floats, depending on how you calculate it. And we're at risk and we might sink. And they'll go, and? Doesn't matter. What are you doing with that heritage? Because the funding landscape has changed. I think there's been a few lessons learned, particularly by the National Lottery, in the halcyon days of the 1990s, where there was quite a few projects that shouldn't have been funded, shall we say, and the ever tightening and structured funding landscape, which is getting worse and worse year on year, and really started to nosedive after 2008, after the credit crunch and the financial crisis. It's so focused now on what is the actual benefit. So your building or your ship or your castle is repaired and will last another 20 years. What does it matter if nobody's coming to visit it? What does it matter if it's having absolutely no effect on anybody's lives at all? It might as well not exist if you've got 300 people coming a year who are interested anyway, but your next door neighbours have been there for 40 years and they never want to stop their head in. What is the point? And you can see from their point of view they're getting no return on their investment other than some sort of appeal to a philosophical idea of, well, heritage is important, but why is it important? It's important because of the effect it has on people's lives. That is what's important. So we've spent the last 2 years on Unicorn trying to answer the so what question, and I think if you look at the funding that we've received over the last couple of years, you'll agree that it's starting to work. And it's all about connecting the dots. And it's not about answering the so what question by becoming a social healthcare service and neglecting all the heritage. It's about how can you tie your heritage into that and do both at the same time. Because otherwise, everybody you will go to asking for money will say, so what? It happens, it still happens. I'm seeing nods from people that I know who work in heritage. It's absolutely key. So, Unicorn had actually a really solid volunteering programme. It had a lot of people coming through who had faced barriers to work, and me and my colleagues were really lucky that we inherited a group of volunteers and a network of charities who were quite happy to send people to Unicorn to volunteer. But we took a look at it with this, how are we going to justify our existence hat on? And we realised that volunteering didn't address a specific need. It wasn't servicing the needs of the organisation, so we couldn't rely on them for staffing, we couldn't rely on them to give regular tours, we couldn't rely on them to do cataloguing and documentation. The amount of supervision they needed was quite high. There was poor record keeping, so we couldn't really say how many and how many hours to any degree of accuracy. There was limited equality and diversity monitoring, and so as summarised there, we knew we were doing something, but we didn't know what it was, and we didn't know how well we were doing it and who we were doing it with. So my colleague Caroline, who's in the audience today, so I have to be extremely careful about what I say, took the reins of this volunteering programme, and we instituted something called Wave Makers, which was just a name for our new approach to volunteering, which we think is working quite well. And it's all based around our local community and providing opportunities for people in Dundee to really establish that Unicorn is important to the locals of Dundee. Because again, if Unicorn is at risk, and Unicorn is at risk, I'm sure you all know that, you don't need me to tell you that, you need the support and the buy-in from your entire community, who will say to their elected officials or their councillors or whoever and say, well, you know, there's an ask here and a need, and I, as a citizen of Dundee, want you to address that need, as opposed to, I don't care, I haven't been in 10 years, I went on for a wedding in 2003 and I never went back. So it's really quite a grassroots thing, and it does work very well once you reassess what a volunteering programme can be. So we, myself and my colleagues, are museum trained. So we went to university, we learned about how museums should be run, and then we worked in museums in various bits in various places, and thought, oh, this is how it works. And then we sort of sat around and thought about our volunteering programme and realised, well, the way that we would run a volunteer programme anywhere else, it's not really working here, it's not really delivering anything, it's hard to manage, it's time intensive, the outputs aren't there in terms of what we want from it as a museum. But we also recognised that we were offering a really valuable service to our volunteers who loved Unicorn and loved coming and seeing, you know, what we did being part of the community. So we changed it slightly. So we came up with these principles which are working quite well, and other museums in the UK have started adopting them, which is great to see. It's really nice to be used as an example and have other people copy our practice as opposed to the way around, copying everyone else's homework. And the first principle there is partnerships allow us to do better work with more people. Put interpersonal relationships first. Volunteers work with people, not heritage. It doesn't matter if you're the Tower of London. If you are horrible to your volunteers and your volunteers are horrible to each other, they will not come and they won't come back. They're hooked in because they like the heritage, but they stay because they like the people. They are doing it because they want to socialise and they want to talk to people, whether that's myself or Caroline or David or anybody who works with us or other volunteers. And the third one is volunteers are not ours if they move on to further things we've done on jobs. So we'll just go through these more generally. So partnerships allow us to do better work with more people. This one is really interesting. So our volunteers, this is based on a sample size of I think around 50 volunteers. Nearly 50%, nearly half, are aged 16 to 25. Now we don't have many volunteers under 16 because of safeguarding reasons, and we don't quite have capacity to keep them safe. But 16 to 25, yeah, that's absolutely fine. That is exceptional for a traditional museum, because the traditional museum volunteer has always been, and still is, unfortunately, retired, educated, middle class. That's it, because they're the ones that have what I would say is the inbuilt sort of national trust membership sort of idea, whereas somebody who is maybe not from a particularly nice postcode and didn't go to university maybe might not care so much. So it's really, really important that we can demonstrate that our programme is working. And we can also say that 65% of our volunteers identify as having a disability of some sort. Again, that's really, really important to us. And how we have managed to achieve this, it's not because we're brilliant, it's because of a slightly different approach to museum volunteering, which is we work with, we keep a list of all the organisations we've worked with over the last 2 years, and it's got to about 50 organisations at the moment. That's PAMIS, which is a charity that works with people with profound and multiple intellectual difficulties, learning difficulties. That's Bernardo's. That's Apex Scotland for offenders. The list goes on and on and on. And what we've done is we have created an environment where we can say to these organisations, we have created a structured and safe and well-supported environment, and we are accepting volunteers, where those volunteers will remain a client of your charity, so we're not responsible for their specific needs that your charity is set up to address, but in partnership we can give them a place where they can get skills in socialising, in presenting to visitors, to strangers, even things like just turning up every day on time when they said that they would. So that's been really important to us, so that's been working really well. And again, actually we've broken this data down further this year, and we can say, I think, somewhere between 30 and 40% of our volunteers come from the lowest three deciles, the lowest 30% in Dundee, in terms of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, so the most deprived households in Dundee. Again, exceptional, because the traditional museum volunteer is retired, middle class, educated. Long-term unemployment, 45% have said that they're long-term unemployed and looking for work. So again, we're getting through. And this is where the story starts to come out. So that gentleman there is Tony. He now works for us. He's been employed with us for over a year, actually, and he came to us as a volunteer after a very difficult few years and struggling to find work and dealing with mental and physical health issues. And you know, depending what day you catch him on, his answer might be different, but I do think he genuinely loves his job. Because he volunteered, and then a role came up, and you know, he was offered it because he was fantastic, he was brilliant, and he said he's given the confidence to go out into the working world, and we were really delighted to support him through that. And we've got Kerry Lee again, who came through to us through a programme with a local higher education, and again, it's just about giving people confidence in a structured but not necessarily overly formal environment. So people volunteer with us for all sorts of reasons, and again, ICRA there, really, well, people who work in museums will understand when I say, wanted to practice her reading and writing English, and if you are reading what other curators have written on scribbled bits of paper, that can be quite a challenge, so she certainly learned a lot. And the testimonials just keep coming through. And as a result of this, we can demonstrate that we have given people skills, because we can say that in 1 year, I think this is 2022's data again, out of a sample size of 50, 41% went on to further employment while volunteering with us, and 27% went on to further education, which is not something that you'd expect a museum to be able to deliver, but it's all because it's done in partnership. We are taking what we are good at and plugging it into other organisations. So the benefits are, there's benefits of volunteers, as outlined, we get different perspectives on our museums. We don't get stuck in what professional people and people who already go to museums expect or want a museum to be. You do get a perspective on what people who don't regularly visit museums think a museum should be or should be doing. And that's how you get those people to come and visit your museum generally. Funding to a certain extent, as I've talked about, so these statistics that we can evidence, hard evidence, testimonials, photographs, statistics, it's all there, allows us to apply for non-traditional museum funding. So there are people that fund museums, and there are people that fund social projects. Now the twain shall meet. We now occupy the slot in the middle where we can go to museum funders, but there are certain funders where we can go and say, well, we're doing this programme here, wouldn't you like to be part of that? It has these benefits. And of course, seeing the real positive impact we have on people's lives, which is the reason we do it. So this is, again, when I said that we were collecting some data before this programme, but not enough, and now we've got all of this stuff, which you can read on our website, and it's really quite impressive. And as a result of this, you'll be sitting there going, well, what's that got to do with museums? What a museum for has changed. It's changed completely over the last 5 years, never mind the last 15. And I think this is recognised. So we were shortlisted by the Museums Association, which is the professional body for all people who work in museums and is a lobbying body for museums and their employees. We were a finalist at the Museums Change Lives Award in 2022. Now, if you're a teeny tiny museum such as Unicorn that has come from basically a standing position in terms of how it approaches volunteering, and the people we were up against, we didn't win. It went to a much better project, but it was the fact that we were in the same room. We were Glasgow University Museums won that year. So the Hunterian won that year for their decolonising project. They won the main award, and we were in the same room with them, just little Unicorn for the work that we've done. And that just goes to show how what people expect from the museum has completely changed. Not just from visitors, but actually more so from funders, from local and national government, and from professional bodies such as these. If we carried on in the way that we always had been, we wouldn't be getting any attention from anybody at all. Now, moving forward into, again, none of this from the present bit of the presentation, we have recently achieved museum accreditation. Now, the museum was briefly registered in the 90s. It was a registered museum, which was the precursor to accreditation, but the accreditation standard, I think the latest revision of the standard is 2018, is much, much more stringent because it has responded to the challenges of museums over the last 30 odd years. And at the moment, museums are so fraught financially and also in such a precarious position in terms of public trust. What are you doing with your collections? Are you looking after them properly? Has anybody stolen anything you've seen in the news recently? So I sit on quite a few pan-Scottish, pan-UK committees, and a lot of the large nationals and large local authority museums go, we've had 10 freedom of information requests this week about where's our collection, what have we done with it? And the way that the sort of seal of approval that you are operating correctly is that you are an accredited museum, and it's an incredibly laborious process to go through. We really made a run of it the last 2 years, but the charity has been aiming for it for the last 5. And it's stringent standards in how you run, how you manage your collections, and how you engage with their users. And behind this, there's cataloguing and documentation procedures, higher standards of information management. There's 40-odd policy documents, procedure documents, tens and tens of thousands of words that have been read and approved and rubber-stamped by our governing body. That these are the things that we are committing to, and it's all about this, a shared and ethical way of doing things. So Unicorn, we can now say, is an ethically run organisation. So who are our users? So again, we've sort of gone through a bit of a tumult lately. So our records of visitor figures in their current form start in 2013, which is when they were collated in a consistent way that I can find in our records. There are some figures that exist previous to that, but not in a usable form. To be blunt, in the 1980s, our visitor figures were 3 and 4 times that because we sat next to Discovery. That's why. And as soon as Discovery left, they started to drop. But we can demonstrate that 2019 was our best ever year for visitors. We had 10,800. But we are sitting on about 10,000 now with a couple of months left of the year. And the difference is that, again, being a museum, we have stopped hosting private events. Now that is contentious, and I recognise that because there's a lot of cultural memory in Dundee about going to events on Unicorn. But what it has meant is that we've been able to focus on being a museum and delivering all that social benefit and delivering a consistent and better quality visit for our visitors. So we can't do both, so we've chosen one. And our visitor figures this year do not include private hire attendees at all. They are all visitors, of which 3,000, so 30%, are through our learning and engagement and outreach programme, which is a huge number of people. And there's a breakdown here which is too small for you to read. Part of me might be grateful for that because I'm not sure how thoroughly I checked these figures before I put them in. But you can also see quite tellingly that in 2021 our average dwell time was sitting between about 39, 40 minutes. And you can see that month by month with a few peaks and troughs, our average visit now this month is standing at 1 hour and 6 minutes. So we've doubled our visitor time by focusing on the museum experience and improving that incrementally. Now, what does learning engagement look like? Well, I think we've had about 120 so-called events this year. All of these photographs are from this year. It's children's activities, it's quiet Monday morning sessions for children who might have processing difficulties or just need a quiet space. It's craft activities, it's school groups, it's any number of things, and all these adorable children who've come onto Unicorn in the last 12 months. And then we also do a lot of stuff with young adults and adults as part of our engagement programme. I mean, this is outside of volunteering, so we have a brew and blether, which is the first Thursday of every month, where people who perhaps feeling a little socially isolated or just want a good chat or want to reminisce can come and they have a nice cup of tea and a biscuit and they have a chat about that. We have any number of projects with local higher and further education groups. That could be quite formal, it could be part of a qualification, or it could just be part of a project where their educators said, right, well, you know, we want to do something a bit more interesting. Can you at Unicorn, you know, provide an opportunity to do that? And the result of this is that in 2021, on TripAdvisor, which is very technical and specialist, right? But in 2021, we were hovering anywhere between number 13 and number 14 of the things to do with TripAdvisor in Dundee. And look at us now, depending how you count it, we are either number 2 or on their page we're number 3. But considering who's in front of us, I think that's fair. And that is just visitor reviews. That's not people who we've gone and said, can you fill out this for? That's people who have visited and then gone, I thought that was great, I'm going to do an online review. And we have held that position for a year now, including a period where we were closed for nearly 2 months, and we managed to maintain it. Now, this is where it starts to get into where are we going in the future, and the current condition is exceptionally poor. Exceptionally poor, and there's any number of reasons for that. But the main reason is that an enormous festival like Unicorn requires a huge amount of resources, financial and otherwise, to maintain in anything like a steady and stable condition. I think it's quite telling that the nearest conservation project to this, which is HMS Victory in Portsmouth, has an endowment of £50 million and a project plan that runs into 100 years. It is one of the most complex heritage engineering projects in Europe, and has the backing of several universities and several large engineering firms and the Ministry of Defence and the British government behind it. And here we are at Unicorn, where we've been basically plodding along for the last few years, and then all of a sudden going, oh, all of our chickens are coming to home to roost at once. So you can see that the condition is poor, and you can see that looking at it from the outside. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to fix things, and we can look at Unicorn, how it has been prepared over the years, and recognise that Unicorn is a complex floating structure. It is a ship, and shipwrights are an almost extinct breed in the UK because the conditions to build something like Unicorn no longer exist. There's a few projects from extremely wealthy countries where they have built replicas of ships from the golden age of sail, but it's not viable. The Unicorn is an expression of a particular socio-economic point in time. It is Britain at the height of empire, with all those resources, physical and material, to draw on, to build a thing, part of its armada, its defence. It's never going to get built again. So now that we've got it, it's a case of preserving it. But that also means that those skills are gone. And it means that not even over the time that the charities own the ship, but having done extensive research, we can look back since the 1870s, certainly since Unicorn came to Dundee, there are things that were done as very reasonable, very sensible repairs at the time that have had a knock-on effect beyond what is the major problem, which is the degradation of the exterior hull of timbers in rainwater. That is the main problem. But there are structural things that have been done in the past that we wouldn't do again now and have caused a lot of problems. And so how do we avoid falling into that trap again? By raising a huge amount of money and paying experts to do it. So in 2021, we got one of the last traditional wooden boat and ship builders in the UK, Tommy Nielsen's and Co., to do a shipwright timber survey. And basically they went around with an auger or a pocket knife and a hammer, and they went around every single accessible timber, interior and exterior, so obviously not including below the waterline, and poked it and prodded it and tapped it and gave it a numerical rating assessing how rotten it was and what its structural integrity was, and filled it in line in a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet runs to the tens of thousands. There's every single one that they could reach was measured and monitored and tested for soundness, and an extensive report written up on that. We then sent that information off to a company called Fenton Holloway. Fenton Holloway were recommended to us by the National Museums of the Royal Navy as the engineering firm that they use for Victory. And the movement now is that for complex structural objects like these, where there are so many unknowns in how they are behaving in their environment that you can't infer from plans because the structure has changed, it's been modified and it's degraded, the only way to really know what's going on in terms of where forces are being directed and diverted is to do computer modelling, and that's what was done here. So that nice point cloud earlier on in the slide, you can see this is a slice through the way, so we have lots and lots of lovely images like that. And also photogrammetry, which is this one here, so a nice photogrammetry model. These were combined with the timber data from the shipwrights into what we call a building management model or a finite element model, depending on what you're using it for. So they built a wireframe here, Fenton Holloway wireframe here, and this is a representation of where all of those timbers are in the ship. And then, of course, you can then plug those numbers in from what the shipwright says, how rotten they are, how strong they are, and you can start modelling heat maps of stress and strain and areas of concern, which you would never be able to do without this sheer amount of computing power. And also, this means that we can take more broad views of what's going on. So the ship is hogging, all ships hog of any size, metal and wooden. They hog in different ways. There was a lot of received wisdom about how Unicorn was hogging, and it was really nice to be able to get that out on paper. So you can see here, this is an exaggerated deflection model. So this hog has been, which is the bending of the ship, has been exaggerated so you'll actually be able to see it on an image of this size, but it gives a schematic of where the changes are in the ship, and this is what it should look like if it had been freshly built. The hogging is of concern, as is a lot of other things, and you can see here this is a schematic of the side of the ship with some of that timber rottenness data filled in. You can see the red bits, there are quite a few of them. So that's a plan view of the starboard side of the exterior of the ship. So this has basically meant that for the first time, and again this is a key point, and it's going back to funders and to the main point at the moment, and I'll talk about this later, Unicorn can't afford to look after itself. And really, in terms of a 100-year view, I don't see how it ever could have, because the problems we have now are from an ad hoc or continuous maintenance. And continuous maintenance is fine for buildings, but it's not fine for something like this, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with maritime history, but as a general rule, vessels of any serious kind apart from leisure craft, so for military purposes or for trading and economic purposes, again, like Unicorn, are built for a specific moment in time, and that time passes and they become obsolete. And so there aren't many ships of the last 200 years that were designed to have a lifespan of more than 30 years, because they were designed for maybe trade that existed in that moment, or a propulsion technology that existed, or an armament technology that had existed, and then that time moves on, and unless you find another use for it, it's gone. And that means that ships are not designed to last on their own without the continuous maintenance of basically having the whole expertise and crew of a Navy ship behind you, which Unicorn hasn't had for a very long time. So what we need to do when we start repairing Unicorn is we need to prove that the way that we're doing it is the right way. Because again, if we go back to those funders and say, Unicorn's rotten and we need to fix it, and we're going to put some planks on it to keep the rainwater out and keep the strength and the stiffness, and now again, those risk-averse funders who treat their funding as an investment where they're expecting a return with minimal risk will say, how do you know that's going to solve the problem, because you've been doing this for ages and it's still happening? So that's what all that was in aid of, and it was a really interesting exercise because without basically lifting a chisel, and it's really interesting because we have had some people say, why are you bothering with all these surveys when the ship is there and it needs work now? Because we can only go to major funders once every 5 to 10 years, and so we have to make sure that it's right that first time, because if they turn us down, the ship will continue to get worse over that period, and we have missed our chance. And I think we've been vindicated because all this, accusations of surveys of junk tomorrow and all that kind of thing means that, well, actually, that survey work without lifting a chisel or a saw won the Excellence in Maritime Conservation Award from National Historic Ships as a recognition of this is how now historic ships are expected to start, plan and then progress their conservation work. You must do it at this high level with this amount of research. As a result of that, we were awarded £100,000 from the Heavy Trust, which at the time was the largest ever grant that we had received. And then shortly after that, we received £1.1 million from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, which again, the largest grant that we have ever received. And we are currently, again, in process with a lottery bid, which I'll tell you about later. And interestingly, when we were in talks with the lottery to fund our broader projects, they said, well, of course, any consideration of your application is concomitant and reliant on you receiving significant funding and investment to repair the ship now. So we were relieved when we got that because it's one more barrier removed, and I really think that that sort of indicated the approach. Something else that's happened is unfortunately the roof was very severely damaged in Storm Arwen, and this is really interesting exercise in inflation of costs and costings over the lifetime of the charity and how things have changed. So Storm Arwen blew the roof off. The roof was a hodgepodge and a patch, and that's fine, replace the bits as and when they were failing. If it's a historic asset, that's a very reasonable approach. But you can see, again, it's been talked about in other places and in much greater detail and with more expertise than me. But the eaves are not that old, they're an extension, and this marine ply here at the time when the roof blew off was only about 18 months old. And it just failed, it completely failed. Our insurers wouldn't pay out because they said, how old's the roof? 200 years old. No, absolutely not. And then we thought, well, it's just a flat roof covering, it can't be that expensive. And we could find shipwrights and boat builders who refuse to touch it because they don't do roofs, they do boats, obviously. And then we found roofers who wouldn't touch it because we don't do ships. And the really interesting thing was that we really, really struggled to find a roofer who would be able to do it, because they say, well, the roofing itself costs you between £30,000 and £50,000, great, fine. I mean, it's a blow, but we could probably manage that. But the scaffolding will cost you £250,000 because we're floating. And the last time we had a cantilevered scaffolding, some 10 years ago, maybe a bit less than that actually, it was about £150,000 because it was a much shorter section. And then we'll see pictures later where in previous years, when the ship was in dry dock, it was 2 ladders with a plank between it and men in brown bonnets and overalls. So the costs of maintenance are not what they used to be. The whole scheme's changed. The only way we managed to get this roof done at all, and it's not perfect, it's not a conservation roof, it is a temporary roof. We had to make a modification to the old roof, which was a real pain to do, but the rainwater had been pouring in by nearly 18 months by that point. It was causing severe damage, and someone threw us a line and said, right, fine, we'll take it, needs must. They actually roof retail parks, and they managed to do it cost efficiently because they managed to find a safe way of working purely from cherry pickers. So we didn't need all that scaffolding. But you can't do that with everything else. At some point, the ship's going to have to go in dry dock, and that's going to be a real consideration. Oh, so I'm just repeating myself here. So there's, perfectly acceptable practice at the time. If the health and safety executive saw that, that would be it. We'd be shut down. And God forbid, if anybody was hurt, then myself and the directors of the charity would end up in court defending themselves and possibly face, a jail term. And so we've got a few things that are different, and this is the thing, the way that Unicorn's been maintained and looked after is unsustainable now. It was not unsustainable at the time. At that time it was grand, it worked, but the context has changed, costs have changed, there's dwindling skills, there's dwindling expertise, materials cost more, labour costs more, planning costs more. This now all needs this scope of project needs a project manager, and they can charge, £70,000 to £150,000 a year. It is now so expensive, and you cannot, again, that reliance on funding, you cannot get that funding unless you're willing to demonstrate that you're working to modern standards. And one of the biggest problems is, where's the infrastructure gone? Where's that dockside heritage infrastructure gone that in the 60s, 70s and 80s was just hanging on through the decline of Clyde shipbuilding and shipbuilding in the UK generally, just hanging on with contracts here and there or hanging on for leisure and pleasure craft, and is now gone. So we're right next to a graving dock. We desperately need a graving dock. We haven't been in a graving dock for years. The tall ship in Glenlee goes in dry dock every 3 to 5 years. It's expected for a vessel that is floating to do that, and we are in quite a precarious position because we can't, because the dry dock's not functional. So there's also questions, well, how come you've managed to get this far without spending any money on it, which is a really interesting question, and it is because we're almost a survivor by accident. We're a survivor of the foresight of the original charity, and the original people involved in the charity who did what all people do who rescue at-risk heritage, is that they see ahead of the curve. They see something that is not valued at the time with a view to, well, in 10 years you're going to really regret that. I mean, there'd been a few, shall we say, crimes against maritime heritage before then, so HMS Implacable and others, where lessons were learned. But there was, Unicorn is important in its own way. Maybe it didn't fight at Trafalgar, but, it's important, it is. So there's the foresightedness of the people who are involved in saving the ship, there's the dedication of the people who are maintaining and running the ship in the interim years. But then there's also other considerations which other ships don't have, and I think it would be interesting to see where Unicorn was if she didn't have any of these. So that's the high quality of the original materials, extensive refits prior to today in the past, not having been used in active service or having sailed any distance, berths in brackish water in a fairly sheltered dock, so that we prefer complete salt water, but brackish water is a preservative on timbers, the opposite of rainwater. An over-engineered construction, thank you Robert Seppings, and being covered over with a roof. So that's fine, but we're now at a breaking point where that's not enough anymore, and Unicorn is in an unsustainable position. And this is basically the plan. I mean, it's been the plan for a long time. There's been attempts, there's been good work done before, but it's now critical because it's not really optional. So this is it really. Repair the East Graving Dock, remove the ship to the East Graving Dock, redevelop the area around the East Graving Dock and create a purpose-built museum. And it's a really difficult problem because it's a three-legged stool. Any heritage project anywhere else in the world, well, in the UK, would be happy with just one of those, and we've got to do all three at the same time, and it's an absolute nightmare of a project. So the first point in developing, why do we need to develop a museum? Well, it's to create a sustainable business model. So we can rely on funders at the moment, but we can't rely on them forever. And again, the way the funding landscape is changing, funders will say, well, why aren't you making your own money? And if you're not making enough money now, what are you going to do so that in 5 or 10 years you are making your own money? Because we don't want to commit to having to go to you every 10 years and say, are you all right? Do you need help? So this is really basic stuff that all museums now expect to offer, which is dedicated exhibition space, learning and classroom space, retail space, cafe, and fully accessible. The quality of interpretation of Unicorn at the moment is poor. The visitor experience is better, but can only be improved up to a point because we are not physically accessible. It is dark, it is cold, it is not an appealing space in the winter to bring small children or older people because it's freezing and it's quite dangerous for them to be running around in. These are all elements of a business model that we cannot explore because we do not have the facilities. Dry dock. Why do we need to get into the graving dock? Because there's works that we cannot do until we are in dry dock, or that would be prohibitively expensive and impossible to do in a floating condition, so we need a dry dock. And again, is that sustainable? Well, you've solved that problem now without a dry dock, but to have anything like a continuous existence, you will need a dry dock, so get it sorted. And then all of a sudden, the requirements of the ship will slow, in theory, if protected from rainwater, so we have plans for a covering or an awning at the moment. And you're generating enough money that the maintenance requirements slowly, I mean it will be over decades, if not a century, but the maintenance requirements will come down and the revenue will come up. And then you're sitting in a nice balanced position. Now it's a hair trigger type thing. Discovery are a really good lesson in this. Discovery until COVID made I think 97-98% of their own revenue, and it's still a challenge for them. So we know we've got a very, very long way to go. However, we also know that there's no cheap way of doing this. And so these two graphs show total income of the charity up until 2014, and then an uptick. Now that is mostly represented by funding applications made to fund the investigative works and research that we've done in the last 2 or 3 years, and this translates into usable assets. You can see all of this in our annual audited accounts. That's all fine. So we spent a huge amount of money. So the charity's average income between 1994 and 2014 was about £75,000 average day. And now at the moment, as of last year, so this doesn't include this year's successes with grants, it was sitting around 260,000 a year. Now, that sounds better, but actually the cost of staff has gone up, the number of staff has gone up, the expectation that you deliver a service of a set standard has gone up. So it sounds great, but this line needs to keep going over the next 50 years, and actually it needs to be an exponential curve. So we're only at the very, very early days of securing this sort of sustained condition for unicorn. So what have we done? Well, we did an optioneering study, so there's no right way to preserve unicorn. The question here is wet or dry, floating or not floating, floating in water or dry in a cradle. There is no right answer. It is a fraught question. All we can do is define what our outcomes and our goals are, which are to minimise the maintenance requirement and preserve as much original fabric as possible. Therefore, after a huge consultation process with 3 workshops and sector experts, that's Meredith, who is head curator of technology and transport at National Museum Scotland, and that's Emma Halford-Forbes, who some of you might know from Discovery. It was sent to National Museums of the Royal Navy, it was sent to National Historic Ships, and the conclusion was that the thing that we need to do with unicorn is, and there's a nice little model here, moving to dry dock, keep unicorn in the dry. That will come with all of its own separate problems, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation, with the rainwater covering, so slow that rot and decay down and reduce the risk of catastrophic flooding. The graving dock is a hugely complex task. As you know, the dock gate, which is a Edwardian replacement from Victorian original, is completely kaput. It's all silted up. I had great fun watching this. This is a remote operated vehicle that just went zipping up and down, and then they had drones doing laser and sonar surveys of the dock, so we have complete models of that. That was £30,000, there you go, to do a survey of the dock. And we're now in the process of architectural feasibility studies, so it won't look like this. That's one thing you always know about artist impressions. This is not what it's going to look like, because we were talking to the architects and the quantity surveyor, and they said, oh, well, we like the picture windows, but extra £500,000. No, thank you. So this is in general the principle. So you've got a redone dockside and a museum and a ship and a covering. Those are the principles. And again, this as an idea hasn't changed in the last several decades, but 2 things have changed. One, the amount of information that we now have backing this up, evidence-based. 2, a huge amount of economic research that has gone into it, building on the work of previous members of the charity. And 3, the now or never situation that Unicorn is in, which is unfortunate, but then at the same time that's tied quite nicely with the amazing successes that we've had over the last 2 years, and justification to the so what question. So I've had Shirley Robertson come round, I've had Chris Marr come round, I've had Chris Law come round, Michael Marr come round, I've had all these MPs and MSPs come round, and they've got, right, well, that was the ship. And then you tell them about the volunteering programme and the social benefit, and go, now that's interesting. Now, if any of you wanted to sponsor an event that, Parliament, just let us know. So it's getting that buy-in. And again, this is quite an old drawing, but the thing that is very exciting, and another thing which is why we feel like the momentum is building up this time. And again, you never know. We have been disappointed before, we're prepared to be disappointed again, is that obviously just here, we are hopefully, they're sort of in a similar position to us, have the Eden projects. And what are the Eden project planning to do? They're planning to have active travel access to the site. And where's the actual travel site going to be? Well, it's going to come from the railway station and Discovery, and it's going to go along the nice, lovely waterside walk, and then you're going to come through the dock, and then you're going to go over a bridge here, and then you're going to go over there, because of course you don't want to walk, if you walk along the A road, it's awful, it's not pedestrian accessible at all. And the only other way would be to go all the way up around to the Arbroath Road and come around, which comes from the railway station, people like that here. So why not do it this way? And oh no, what a shame, you've had to walk past this really interesting historic ship at very reasonable entry fees. And that's the problem that we have at the moment, have had for a very, very long time, is that this is, at the moment where Unicorn is a cul-de-sac. We have no passing footfall at all, and there is no economic centre point to pull people through. So we're too small to be that. And the Eden project comes around, and all of a sudden you have that pull that will now drag people away from the V&A and Discovery through the rest of the city, which will be beneficial to everybody else and us. So we're quite excited about that. So phasing and project planning is monstrously complex. Hundreds of thousands of words have been written over the last year, dozens of surveys and investigations and analyses, consultations. It never stops, and it costs money, and it's very, very difficult to keep your operational budget because, of course, funders are very happy to fund exciting, sexy capital projects. So that's £600,000 that we've spent on work so far in the last 3 or 4 years. Great, brilliant, and the funders will be delighted to say. And then you say, can I have £25,000 to pay for a core member of staff, of which we have 3 full-time staff? And they go, no, we don't. We don't do operational costs. So the real challenge is, how do we keep our operational costs going at the same time? That is really difficult. So if any of you know any millionaires who don't particularly mind what conditions are attached to the funding, you can laugh. It has worked before. I emailed John Paul de Horier's office last year, who is the billionaire who owns a tequila and hair product company, and he said, yeah, great, have £20,000. So that was a proportion of their staff member salary paid for, because it was given their conditions. So you can see it's just an absolute nightmare. This is from engineers Beckett Rankin, who are a fascinating company. If you look them up, they're world-leading experts in this type of work. We've been working with them very closely, commissioned them to do 2 or 3 pieces of work, and this is their very basic plan. And out of all of these planning scenarios, the one thing that we have been doing is we said, well, we have to explicitly state what will happen if we do nothing. And the answer is the ship will get worse and worse and worse, the operational capacity of the charity will get less and less and less, we will be in a worse and worse position to arrest things getting worse and worse, so you're really making a solid case for funding, but as I say, nothing's guaranteed. And that's the end of the talk, so I think I've left you enough time for questions, and I hope you found it interesting and that some of you found it as sort of an interesting update. I know it does look like you walk past Unicorn and just go, oh God, it's getting worse. I mean, I have to walk past it every single day, but stuff is happening. We're like a swan. We're all activity underneath, and soon we will be starting our emergency repair works using that 1.1 million from the Memorial Fund. So hang on in there. I'll say that to myself in the mirror when I get home as well. But yes, thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.